Lewis Hamilton has just exploded after Ferrari delivered one of the most disastrous weekends of his entire career in Las Vegas. A single qualifying meltdown forced him to start 20th, and a race full of mistakes turned what should have been a comeback drive into a painful one-point finish. You are about to hear how Hamilton tore into Ferrari for the errors that destroyed his night, and why this might be the moment that defines his entire first season with the team. Stay right here because this confrontation has enough weight to change everything for Ferrari heading into the final races. The Las Vegas weekend collapsed for Hamilton the moment qualifying began because the conditions combined with Ferrari's preparation errors pushed him into one of the most difficult sessions of his 18-year career. The wet surface eliminated grip from the opening minutes, and Ferrari failed to give him tires in the correct operating window. He cannot stabilize the car through the high-speed corners, and each flying lap lacked the temperature necessary for traction. By the end of the session, the team realized the extent of the mistake. Hamilton was eliminated in the first qualifying phase and forced to start 20th on a narrow street circuit where track position governs everything. As the grid formed for the race, the scale of the challenge ahead of him became clear. He was 19 positions behind his teammate Charles Leclerc, who began in clean air while Hamilton sat deep inside the turbulence of midfield traffic. The lights went out and Hamilton spent the early laps navigating cars with unpredictable grip and inconsistent braking points, while also managing extremely low temperatures that made tire warm-up nearly impossible. Each overtaking attempt demanded perfect timing because the dirty air restricted downforce whenever he moved off the racing line. The pressure of a recovery drive grew heavier with every corner. The cold asphalt created a unique challenge that worsened Ferrari's situation. Every driver struggled, but Hamilton's position meant he suffered the most because his tires cooled constantly whenever he was forced to slow behind another car. He had to protect the fronts from sliding while also generating enough heat to access grip at corner entry. The car refused to respond with the balance he needed. The front end lacked precision, and the rear could not provide enough traction to commit to decisive overtakes. Even when he gained positions through smart driving the pace he required to climb into the top 8 remained out of reach. As the race progressed, Ferrari attempted to stabilize his strategy. The team placed him on a long initial stint to avoid the midfield pit cycle, hoping that clean air would appear later in the race. However, the field remained tightly packed and Hamilton spent much of the early phase trapped behind slower cars, unable to access the aerodynamic efficiency the Ferrari requires to extract competitive lap times. Each lap spent in turbulence increased tire degradation, forcing him to manage pace rather than attack. The plan that aimed to create opportunity instead placed him in a prolonged defensive situation. The middle portion of the race emphasized the core problem. Hamilton could not bring the hard compound tire into the ideal temperature window quickly enough, and the cold Las Vegas surface punished every small error. When the tires did stabilize, his pace improved, but the damage was already done in terms of track position. He spent too many laps fighting for grip rather than racing freely. This limitation kept him from closing the gap to the group ahead. The midfield train he needed to break through continued to extend the distance by a few tenths each lap, turning his recovery drive into an uphill battle with no strategic alternative. By the closing laps, Hamilton had executed a disciplined drive and passed 10 cars, yet the maximum reward for that effort was only a single point. He crossed the line 10th, while Leclerc finished 6th after a much cleaner race. The difference between the two Ferrari drivers highlighted how heavily the early mistakes shaped the weekend. Starting 20th erased Hamilton's chance to demonstrate Ferrari's true pace and forced him into a race defined entirely by damage limitation. The Las Vegas Grand Prix became a clear example of how preparation errors, cold conditions, and poor starting position converged to produce a result that fell far short of expectations. Hamilton's Las Vegas weekend unraveled the moment qualifying began because the conditions exposed Ferrari's lack of preparation and left him without the tire performance he needed to set a competitive lap. The report confirms that he struggled significantly in the wet conditions and failed to find the correct grip level at any stage of the first qualifying session. The car refused to respond with stability, and the cold surface robbed him of the temperature required for aggressive corner entry. By the time the checkered flag fell on the session, Hamilton's elimination was sealed, and he was classified 20th. It was one of the lowest starting positions of his entire career, and it defined the scale of the recovery mission that awaited him. The documents show that the race started with Hamilton facing an enormous challenge. Beginning 20th on a narrow street circuit created a scenario where overtaking would require both precise racecraft and perfect tire management in conditions that were already working against him. He spent the opening laps surrounded by cars struggling for grip and balance, and each attempt to generate tire temperature in the turbulence of the midfield proved difficult. The difference between his path and Leclerc's path became clear immediately. Leclerc began the race in clean air with the ability to manage tires and rhythm, while Hamilton spent each corner improvising reactions to the unpredictable behavior of the cars around him. The race pace itself demonstrated that Ferrari's decisions in qualifying had fundamentally shaped the dynamic of the Grand Prix. The report shows that Hamilton gained 10 positions through the race, which reflected determination and skill, but the lack of early track position meant he spent the first half of the event in dense traffic. Every defensive move from midfield rivals forced him to compromise his racing line and lose front-end grip. In a car that depends heavily on balance to generate lap time, these constant interruptions prevented Hamilton from accessing the potential pace the Ferrari carried later in the evening. The 1 point he earned was a direct consequence of starting from last. The data from the end of the race provides a clear comparison that emphasized how much was lost in qualifying. Hamilton finished only 8 seconds behind Nico Hülkenberg, who secured 9th place, meaning that a clean Saturday performance would likely have placed him firmly in the points. The final classification showed that Hamilton gained 10 positions to finish 10th, while Leclerc finished 6th after a relatively smooth race. This difference in outcome was not driven by pace variation, but by the contrasting starting positions. The Ferrari in Hamilton's hands never had the opportunity to race freely, and the result demonstrated how severe the penalty is when a qualifying session collapses. The gap to the race winner revealed the full impact of the compromised weekend. Hamilton crossed the finish line 59.369 seconds behind Max Verstappen, a figure that reflected not a pace deficit, but the time lost navigating through the midfield congestion. Every lap spent behind slower cars delayed his progress and reduced the effectiveness of his strategy. By comparison, Leclerc's cleaner run allowed him to execute his race plan with fewer interruptions, and that difference was reflected in the points earned. The report underlines that Hamilton's recovery drive was as effective as possible under the circumstances, but highlighted that the damage was done before the race even began. The summary within the document confirms that Hamilton describing the performance as frustrating was justified. The conditions, the preparation errors, and the strategic limitations converged to deliver a race where his driving could only limit the damage rather than reverse it. Ferrari acknowledged that the rhythm he needed was disrupted from the outset, and that the execution on Saturday set the tone for the entire event. Starting 20th on a circuit with limited overtaking opportunities shaped every stage of his race, and the final 10th place result reflected the consequence of those early mistakes. The Las Vegas weekend became a lesson in how even small misjudgments in qualifying can create an unrecoverable scenario on race day. Ferrari entered the Las Vegas weekend expecting cooler conditions, but struggled to predict how dramatically the temperature drop would influence tire behavior. The low grip surface meant that tire warm-up became the defining challenge of the entire weekend. The report makes clear that Hamilton suffered significant losses in qualifying because the tires never reached the optimal operating window. This failure directly affected braking stability and corner entry confidence. In a street circuit environment where precision determines lap time, this lack of temperature punished Hamilton far more than it punished drivers with clearer track positions or more effective tire preparation. Ferrari's misreading of the conditions placed him on the back foot before the race even began. The race data shows that Ferrari adopted a conservative strategy to counter the uncertainty created by the qualifying disaster. Hamilton began the Grand Prix on medium tires, aiming to extend the first stint long enough to avoid the early pit window. Their hope was that a late track evolution phase would open opportunities to undercut cars ahead. However, the midfield congestion prevented him from building tire temperature consistently, and each time he closed to within striking distance of the car ahead, the turbulence washed away the front-end grip he needed. The strategy was logical from Ferrari's standpoint, but failed to reflect the reality of starting at the very back on a cold street circuit. The report highlights that Hamilton's car balance deteriorated during the middle portion of the race, especially after switching to the hard compound tire. The cold asphalt created a narrow performance window, and the Ferrari struggled to generate heat quickly enough to give Hamilton the confidence required for decisive overtakes. He communicated repeatedly that the front axle lacked bite, and that the rear struggled for traction under throttle. This imbalance forced him to manage the tires rather than attack for higher positions. The difficulties he experienced were not the product of driver error, but a sign that the car's setup had not been optimized for the unusually demanding surface. Ferrari's decision not to commit to an aggressive second stop contributed to Hamilton's limitations in the final phase of the race. Their belief was that track position mattered more than tire offset, but the data shows that cars ahead benefited from cleaner air and longer stints where they could manage temperatures more effectively. Hamilton was forced to drive defensively to protect tire performance, which reduced his ability to close the gap to rivals in the top 10. While the strategy kept him in the points, it also ensured that his maximum result would be limited. His position became a compromise rather than a platform for meaningful recovery. The comparison with Charles Leclerc's race further illustrates how strongly initial track position dictated the final outcome. Leclerc began in clean air and maintained a consistent rhythm throughout the Grand Prix, enabling him to execute Ferrari's plan with minimal interference. Hamilton, by contrast, spent most of his race reacting to cars ahead, adjusting lines, and managing tires in conditions that caused instability whenever he strayed from the optimal racing surface. The report emphasizes that the pace potential of the two Ferraris was not dramatically different. The divergence in finishing positions came almost entirely from qualifying preparation, tire temperature management, and the strategic trade-offs imposed by starting 20th. The technical summary confirms that Las Vegas punished any team that misread tire behavior, and Ferrari's challenges amplified those consequences. The combination of cold temperatures, minimal grip, and heavy traffic created conditions where Hamilton had no opportunity to compensate for the earlier mistakes. His 10th place finish represented both the limit of what the car could achieve in the circumstances and the cost of errors that prevented him from starting higher. The report leaves no doubt that the team's failure in tire management and qualifying preparation shaped the entire weekend and turned the race into a battle for damage limitation rather than a chance to fight for meaningful points.